In an age where people feel compelled to stay in their lane and practice their religion without questioning it, or on the other extreme, fall prey to transhumanist propaganda and neo-pagan pseudo-religion, Frithjof Schuon's perennial philosophy is just as much a breath of fresh air today as it was more than half a century ago. He is easily one of the greatest philosophers, and more importantly, he was an incredibly pious individual who valued gnosis, understanding, passion, and the authentic human experience. It would be an understatement to say that his philosophy and worldview has influenced my own spirituality. Without the writings of Frithjof Schuon, my approach to polytheism and natural religion may have gone in a very different direction. I first looked to Schuon when I was deconverting from Christianity. His works helped me to reconcile my complex past as a Christian with the hidden esoteric wisdom of not only the Christian faith, but of all the religious traditions of the world. Now I take no issue with making offerings to Dionysus or Enki, while later on that same day, taking time to contemplate the mystery of the world's many religions, including Christianity, Islam, Judaism, Buddhism, Hinduism, and many other traditions. I feel as though Schuon, who believed in the existence of a unifying truth behind every religion, would largely support such an endeavor. Schuon's brand of perennialism taught me that certain exoteric qualities of a religion may in fact be false or misleading on the surface, only to reveal a hidden esoteric layer underneath. The esoteric layer is universal wisdom and salvation, while the exoteric layer contains contradictions and literal beliefs that often function instrumentally to communicate the esoteric parts to non-philosophers and ordinary everyday people. This is actually the entire framework of Schuon's worldview. He believed that it was possible for certain souls to fully discern between the absolute and the relative, or in Hindu terminology, Atma and Maya. This is especially true when it comes to man's quest to find a religion that speaks to his soul.
And how do we know that this metaphysical meaning is the truth?
Because we have the truth in ourselves. You see, it's we know the truth because we are the truth, but only this knowledge is hidden by ice because of the fall of man. But the realized man has an eye in the heart.
It makes sense that as I started to switch from Christianity to Platonism, Schuon and the teachings of the perennial philosophy would solve a lot of problems for me, and in the end, I became much more cordial and at peace with my Christian roots. It was also comforting to see that many of the masters of the perennial philosophy were well versed in the theology of Plato and the Vedanta, two theological traditions which tended toward mystical polytheism. Without overstating my analysis, all I'll say is that much of the evidence available in Schuon's writings promote the idea that he outwardly supported traditional polytheist practices and may have even personally believed in a style of polytheism similar to that of Plotinus and Proclus. The second half of that claim is somewhat speculative, so just keep in mind that I'm doing my very best to not put words in the mouth of a man who was, by nearly every metric, supernatural in his intellectualism. So let's begin by taking a look at Frithjof Schuon's Light on the Ancient Worlds. It's a good place to start for this sort of topic. His writing here not only implies that he accepted polytheism as a legitimate worldview when it comes to the world's many theological traditions, he also validates it as a valuable mode of understanding, stating that the traditional Platonic theology has its roots in the more primordial polytheistic days of early human history. He explains, quote, "It is false that the triad of Socrates, Plato, Aristotle represents the summit of an entirely natural thought, a summit reached after long periods of effort and groping. The reverse is the truth. All the triad did was to crystallize, rather imperfectly, a primordial and intrinsically timeless wisdom, actually of Aryo-Indo-Iranian origin, and typologically close to the Celtic, Germanic, Mazdian, and Brahmanic esotericisms." End quote. All these traditions are natural polytheistic religions, and Plato is able to uncover the esoteric wisdom of these religions through his theological teachings and unique approach to polytheism. Schuon's claim here seems to rest on his underlying motive to condemn any and all over-reliance on rationalism, and he does this by noting that the purest polytheistic practices predate the rational discourse of Plato and his contemporaries. But he is also aware that there was a divine providence to the ancient rational philosophers, and he even speaks of this sort of providence elsewhere, championing the epithet of Plato in which he is referred to as the divine, and advocating for philosophers who refer to Plato as one who fills all spaces with light. Because Schuon places the triad of Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, as well as their predecessor Pythagoras, on an extraordinarily high pedestal just beneath pure revelation itself, polytheistic tendencies of the Platonic sort can be found frequently in Schuon's essays. Here is an interesting example. Quote, "All divine aspects, extrinsic as well as intrinsic, are linked together by virtue of the unity of the essence." End quote. In just this passage, there is a clear influence from Plotinus and Proclus. For comparison, listen to the following excerpt from Plotinus. Quote, "Each god is all the gods coming together into a one." Plotinus understood that each god was the one itself made knowable to the lower emanations of existence. Proclus later uses this understanding to craft his own theology, and we actually see Schuon implementing a similar framework in the following example. Here is an excerpt from Schuon's book, Treasures of Buddhism. He states, "To discuss the question of whether the delivered saints are annihilated in God, or whether they remain within him, is pointless, since it amounts to knowing whether the divine names are distinct or indistinct in God. Now every divine name is God, but none is any of the others, and, above all, God is not reducible to any one of them." End quote. That last part sounds like a direct quote from Proclus, so let's compare the passage we just read to Proclus's Elements of Theology. Quote, "Every god is a beneficent unity or a unific goodness, and each god, so far as he is a deity, has this hyparxis, summit. The first god, however, is simply good and simply one, but each posterior to the first is a certain goodness and a certain unity." End quote. What Proclus is saying here is that each god is the one in their own unique way, and all things participate wholly in each god because the gods themselves are a one. It's just as Plato teaches in the Parmenides that if the one is, then it is a multiplicity. God is the one, therefore God is either a many or God is not. This, I think, is the best way to analyze the text from Treasures of Buddhism as it is plainly written. For our final comparison, if we continue further in the same book, we arrive at a striking but potent example of Schuon's apparent advocacy of Platonic polytheism and henatology. From page 74, quote, "The Virgin Mary is at once created and uncreated. Even if esotericism cannot recognize Mary's divine reality without entering into insoluble contradictions, it is nonetheless able to recognize that the Virgin Mary is created before creation. And this amounts to identifying her with the universal spirit envisaged more particularly in its feminine, maternal, and beneficent function." End quote. It really does amaze me just how similar this sort of description of the Virgin Mary is to the way Plotinus and Proclus describe the nature of the gods. Here is Plotinus writing on the love god Eros. Quote, "That love is a person is beyond doubt. There is a strenuous activity of contemplation in the soul. There is an emanation toward it from the contemplated, and Eros, a god of love, is born. Of course, love as an emotion will take its name from love the person, since a real being cannot but be prior to what lacks this reality. The mental state will be designated as love, like the hypostasis, though it is no more than a particular act directed towards a particular object. But it must not be confused with the absolute love, the divine being." End quote. First off, wow, just wow. Plotinus never ceases to amaze me with his writings. It is no wonder that he is considered to be one of Frithjof Schuon's inspirations, and furthermore, this passage by Plotinus reflects a strikingly similar understanding of divinity to what is being asserted in the writings of Schuon. Taken as a whole, these passages allow us to deeply relish in the continuity between the ancient Platonists and the teachers of the perennial philosophy. But there's still something that needs to be addressed. Frithjof Schuon was a Sufi Muslim. The primary tenet of Islam is the rejection of idols and polytheism so that one may fully submit to Allah. In fact, this submission to Allah and the subsequent acceptance of Muhammad's prophethood has a specific name. It is called the Shahada, and it is necessary to recite it if one wishes to convert to Islam. So how does Schuon reconcile his willingness to accept a variety of religious faiths, some of which are polytheistic in nature, with the Islamic belief that there are no other gods but Allah? For answers, we need to look no further than Schuon's essay, The Ambiguity of Esotericism. Here, Schuon doesn't necessarily believe that Islam, on a more esoteric level, intentionally separates itself from idol veneration and polytheistic psychology. In fact, he embraces this aspect of Islam, so long as everyday practitioners of the religion use it with reverence toward the singular, absolute truth. Listen to the following quote from the essay. "There is no room for polytheism or idolatry in Islam, and yet they are to be found in it, insofar as they have a positive and thus legitimate meaning. Muslim polytheism is represented by the 99 names of God, and Muslim idolatry by the Kaaba and the Black Stone, the Kaaba being prolonged by the prayer niche in mosques. One could object that these are not images, no doubt, but nonetheless they are material objects, situated in space. A tree is not an image either, and yet if one were to pray towards a particular tree intentionally, while disregarding the canonical direction, the Qibla, Islam would term it an idol. Logically and strictly speaking, Muslims ought to pray with their eyes closed, which they do not, and without regard to a ritual direction. Abstraction would then be complete, but in fact they pray before one visible thing, the mihrab, and in the direction of another thing, the Kaaba. Thus it can be seen that the purism of a religion is necessarily relative when it is a question of things that are justified in themselves, and, moreover, opportune. What Schuon is trying to say here is that exoteric Islam is predicated on the declaration of a radical monotheism, but that, like any religion, the esoteric aspect is capable of advocating for the human person's primordial spiritual mindset, which tended toward traditional polytheistic worship. But since primordial man had a certain purity to his intent, a purity which Schuon at no point claims is a radical monotheism, primordial man's traditional polytheistic practices are, by Schuon standards, acceptable with the help of divine guidance and proper discernment. I made this video with the intent to show that Schuon's views are equal parts elastic and straightforward. What matters to Frithjof Schuon is the preservation of a singular, absolute truth, not whether or not the singular truth goes by a plurality of divine names or unique identities. I think that Maruf Shah, who is an expert on Frithjof Schuon, stated it best when he wrote, quote, "Schuon isn't much disturbed by the phenomenon of polytheism. He instead emphatically rejects any paganization that it may come to have. According to Schuon, polytheism becomes pagan only when it forgets Atma and attributes absoluteness to diversity and thus to relativity." End quote. The true enemy, then, is not polytheism, but relativism. Primordial man was able to distinguish between the two, and so, in a continuing tradition such as the Platonic tradition, we ought to be able to do the same. The beauty that flourishes as a result of traditional polytheism is simply too good to ignore, and it properly brings the human person back to their primordial roots. As a demonstration of this beauty, I'd like to recite my favorite passage from the Mesopotamian epic poem, Atrahasis. "The god Enki made his voice heard, and spoke to the great gods. On the 1st, 7th, and 15th of the month, I shall make a purification by washing. Then one god should be slaughtered, and the gods can be purified by immersion. Nintu shall mix clay with his flesh and his blood. Then a god and a man will be mixed together in clay. Let us hear the drumbeat forever. Let a ghost come into existence from the god's flesh. Let her proclaim it as a living sign, and let the ghost exist so as to not forget the slain god."